Hello and welcome to a brand new episode of Byte-size Opinions. My name is Vladi and I'm your host for today. And with me, I have the pleasure to introduce you Adam, who is a CTO coach, a fractional CTO, and has 30 years of experience in the industry, out of which 10 are as CTO. And I must say, you don't look the part, you look much younger than that. Congratulations. He helps clients accelerate their software delivery through a focus on strategy, people, and processes. He also hosts the CTO Playbook podcast, and he's a hoster for the CTO Craft Mixer events in Gothenburg and Stockholm. Welcome, Adam.
Thanks so much. Great to be here.
Impressive list of events and participations in communities you're part of.
I think once you've been working in the industry for a while, you sort of pick up a bit of background and baggage to carry with you. But I think the big thing for me is being able to, contribute back to people who are earlier on the journey than I am. And that's, I think, one of the big things about community, that there aren't that many communities focused on CTOs. And so it's just wonderful to be able to be a part of that and help in those communities.
Indeed, indeed. That's also what I like to talk with whoever wants to show up in at least in the CTO craft events. I got questions from senior engineers, and they're like, "Oh, I'm still not a CTO or a tech lead. Can I still join?" Yes, of course. That's one easy way to learn what difficulties we have, what problems we faced, what topics we discuss.
Absolutely. And I think it's often the point at which people discover, oh, it really is as much about the business as it is about the technology.
Yes, indeed. That's a very strong point. All right, let's get the show on the road, shall we?
Let's go for it.
So the first topic is TDD, test-driven development.
Yeah, so test-driven development is one of those things that, in my opinion, is a little bit overrated. I think it has its place and it's very powerful, but I think there's several other competing models that you can work with that allow you to get just as good results. I mean, don't get me wrong, TDD does create good results and it allows you to have very secure software. But I think sometimes what it can also do is trap somebody into that realm of I must create everything in a testable way first. So it creates a good structure, it creates maintainable code. But sometimes if you have something where you just, especially in early stage startups, you really need or want to move particularly fast, you're sort of breaking the rules of TDD if you just go in and hack something in, put it in place. Now you're either left with tech debt or guilt or both, depending on how you look at it. So, I think it's one of those things where it has its place. It can be very useful. It can be very useful in a migration project as well, where you know exactly what it is you're trying to do. But I wouldn't apply it in all scenarios. It's not one of those things I think is sort of one of those things that should be universally applied to software engineering efforts.
All right. Yeah, you mentioned something about it has competition basically. What did you have in mind?
I mean, there's mob programming, there's extreme programming. There's um, what do you call it? Trunk based development, essentially, where you basically get things out into an environment where you're getting it into live and using the customers. I mean, I know you're often testing metrics there rather than testing correctness and validity. But especially in an environments where you've got many, many, many users and therefore a bunch of different edge cases and side cases, being able to build tests for all those things is sometimes slower than just to get the software out without as much testing in it and let the feedback and the metrics show you what's working, what's not, or indeed what's broken, what's not.
Hmm.
Spending extra time on engineering something that's going to be an experiment to test, sometimes there's better ways of spending time and money.
Interesting. I didn't. I mean, I thought that trunk-based development cannot be done without tests unit. A lot of them. So in a way, they go hand in hand in my mind.
It does depend on where you look at the risk, right? So a lot of test-driven development is designed to reduce the risk and cost of restructuring and changing the code base. For example, if you want to refactor areas of code, you can be confident that the functionality can remain the same, even though the structure of the code changes. But if the actual structure of the code itself is itself experimental, quick to get out, and you are testing some code perhaps through feature flags that are based on a very small segment of users, then there's a question to say, well, do you want to spend a lot of time? And often it sort of doubles the implementation time to build, a testing framework and correctness that's going to, be robust to refactoring as you go and put that experimental code in and check whether there's even a demand for something in that area. So
Mhm.
I don't think the two are mutually exclusive, or that they have to go hand in hand.
Right. That's a good observation there. Okay, let's move on to the next topic, which is Scrum.
Scrum, I think, is one of those things that is kind of underrated in some places and overrated in others, which is a very crude way of saying it depends. Scrum has its place again. So I think Scrum is very useful in environments where you are you have a very clear idea to be able to deliver to a team of what it is that it needs to do, and where you want to try and remove heroism. The one person who's going to
Mhm.
carry things forward, and everybody else kind of follows in and fits in the fills in the bits. But I think also there's also places where Scrum isn't as good, when you got very, very changing requirements and unknowns to cover. Um, Sort of doing everything as a group doesn't always work out brilliantly. So yeah, I mean, it depends. I'm going to be a bit on the fence with this one. Underrated, overrated. It
It,
has its place and it's good, but
it
it's not like it should be universally applied either.
it sounded to me that you're saying that when you actually need to be agile, Scrum gets in the way.
It really can do. It really can do. I mean, I often think of agile with a small a. I think if you look at
Mhm.
agile with, and go back to the manifesto, it was only 4 points, right?
Yeah,
Whereas if you
yeah.
look at something like safe, my goodness me, how many rules are there in safe? It's crazy, and I think Scrum has sort of built up this cult following in a similar kind of way. Like it's the one true way. And I think if you go back to the raw principles, you see a very different version of it. It's actually building software is actually very simple process wise from that perspective. And building a lot of sort of rules and guards around it, it can work in environments where there's a lot of problems. If you're building stuff where, even one mistake causes a death, clearly you want a lot of safeguards. If you're building something where, a small change can cause millions of dollars of value being wiped out, you need more care and therefore more process, because more process generally involves more people doing more checking. But it's in the same way, if you're building something where it's very low value, and very distributed in terms of where the value is. I mean, online gaming is one of those areas. Do you need to be so robust in the process and structures you put in place?
Hmm. Hmm. So you associate Scrum with having robust processes, basically.
Not always.
Not all. Okay, got it. Moving on to the next topic is working at a startup from a perspective of a software engineer.
Definitely underrated.
Okay.
I've heard people talk about working at a startup as being better than an MBA. I've heard people talk about junior engineers who joined a startup and have had as much experience in 6 months as others who had in 5 years. Essentially because of the sheer variety of things that has to get done and the rate of change. Generally, a startup, I like the definition that a startup is a temporary organization in search of a business model that works. And from that perspective, the very nature of the temporary aspect of it means that it's constantly changing. And in a
Yeah.
constant state of change, you're in a constant state of learning. Um, and so that that learning is sort of accelerated and also very varied. And that's why I think working in a startup is massively underrated.
And if you split a senior versus a junior, would you still keep the same answer?
Absolutely. I think as a senior engineer in a startup, yeah, sure, you're going to be putting things in place that you know how to do, but there's going to be so many other problems that you don't know how to solve that you're going to be figuring out. And so many areas that are on the edge of what you've got experience of that you need to sort of be able to put something credible in place, that your learning won't necessarily go deeper, but it will definitely go broader.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. Now let's talk about a totally different topic, which is Web3.
Um, and this is one of those areas where I know enough to know that I don't know as much as I could do or should do, really. So
Okay.
um, I'm probably going to say that Web3 is probably overrated. I think probably the reason for that is because if it were underrated, we'd be seeing a lot more of it already. It's not like it's something new or been around very recently. I think using the blockchain in general for anything that isn't to do with crypto, in theory, is a really good and solid idea. I saw lots of potential for it in things like conveyancing and legal
Mhm.
work. But then where are
But
all the great products that use it? Where's the evidence in the market that it's, utterly fantastic? Um, and it's not that I'm saying that it isn't there. It might be, but it's not visible. It's not widespread. It's not mainstream. Maybe that's the
yeah,
case of yet. Um, but for that reason, I'd rank it as being overrated.
would you say that perhaps the technology, because it was used mainly for crypto and NFTs and other similar projects, which have mostly a bad reputation of scams and stuff like that, maybe that's what's holding the actual technology back?
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is because I think most engineers are rather pragmatic when they take a new technology. And most people who are startup oriented are rather experimental in their approach to things. And so, therefore, things like reputation and history aren't such an important factor. I think it's more about what can I use it for? How can I be innovative with it? How can I apply this to a real problem and create value? And there's definitely been some value created, but not as much as was predicted from the investment boom that went into crypto. Oh, we're talking what, 5, 6 years ago, right?
All right. Now, the next topic is something that I'm hoping that next year we will not have to talk about: AI replacing software engineers.
Oh, way overrated. Um, yeah, I mean, when you say, I hope we're not going to have to talk about it, it's I think be one of those things where people don't really realize actually AI is not going to replace software engineers. So I look at AI in the context of generative AI, particularly with regard to software engineering on a spectrum of evolution of the tools that's been happening since the 1970s, right? I mean, in the 1960s, we began to get visual editors, Vi, Emacs. Then we got sort of the IDE, the integrated development environment, which originally was actually called CASE, computer aided software engineering. Um, from the IDEs, then we ended up with templated structures, build tools, build scripts. Make was available in the 70s and evolved from there. And so therefore that made debugging easier. I mean, it's been a long time since most people have had to go into something like GDDB and actually go and debug code at on console level, right? So tools have improved, error messages have improved, compilers have improved, project management has improved. Things like GitHub and source code control have improved massively. And so therefore, automatically generating code is just a continuation, I think, on that spectrum of removing the boilerplate from the inversion of control to IDE templated pages to things like Ruby on Rails, where there was basically patterns to follow that were not only best practice but also optimized into the way that things are working. And so the AI generating code for you that is more personalized. I think I see it as just a continuation on that spectrum of where we've been coming along in terms of aiding the software engineer in the process. And it's much like when you look at civil engineering, like people don't end up using, rollers and levers and big sticks anymore. We've got machinery and heavy duty industrial machinery to help with the work of construction and things like scaffolding to make it safer and so on. So I think when you look at it in terms of the evolution of the tool base that we're using, the AI at the moment is more like a better screwdriver in the toolkit than it is like, a self-driving screw.
Yeah, yeah. Um, you made a good point with the generative AI part, because I think we had machine learning and AI in production, and we were actually using it without us knowing it for quite a while now.
And I think if you just look at something like the Google search, right? Google search hasn't been a basic database lookup for many, many years, right? Yeah. And so when you think about it, okay, I've been using AI for years. And so from that perspective, a lot of us have been using AI, but not necessarily called it AI or generative AI or whatever. Whereas
Mhm.
the techniques and tools that go into making generative AI possible is one subset of the overall AI piece. And I think that research and those tools have been going on for ages. I mean, you just have to look up AI winter on Wikipedia, for example, to see just how many times the funding in AI has dropped out of the floor.
Okay, I'll make a note to look that up after the show. Okay, Now, we mentioned in the TDD topic, you mentioned multi-programming, but we have the topic of pair programming.
Pair programming, I think, is underrated. And there's a number of reasons for that. I think pair programming as a generalization of extreme programming, I think is actually quite a good one. And one of the main reasons why I like pair programming is because it allows an element of review to happen at the point of coding. It helps with the communication aspect before even writing the first line of code on whatever change or creation it is that you're making. And it also really helps with that um, coaching, teaching, and upgrading of um, thinking that goes into the problem solving. And it's that stage is a bit that's misunderstood, I think, a lot in terms of when people think about coaching, mentoring, teaching, and so on. Because it's not just about how I do it. Okay, I put my fingers on the keyboard and I type these keys and I get this code out. That's doing it. It's the hard bit is how do I think about it? How do I break down this problem that I need to do? And what are the other elements I need to think of that are coming from the side, whether it's third party APIs, dependencies across our software, whether it's interactions you're going to expect, or unexpected interactions that might happen, a server disappearing or a service going offline. And so therefore it's that completeness of thinking that you share before you even put the code in place. And then once you put the code in place, well, your code review is kind of done. Two of you have done it. So what's wrong with then committing that straight on to the trunk, even straight into master or main? Sorry, main it's called these days. Showing my age there. And so, I think from that perspective, pair programming is underrated. Should it be used all the time? No, because I think there is a huge value in people sitting down and thinking down and breaking down a problem on their own. But in terms of sharing how to go about do that, it's a really, really good technique.
Mhm, mhm. I had a thought there, but I just lost it now. I'm sure it will come back to me after the show,
As it always does.
but
Yep.
as it always does, yes. All right. We can move on to the next topic, which is again jumping to a different area, which is the social network LinkedIn.
Is it underrated or overrated? I think on balance is probably underrated. Although you probably wouldn't believe it if you're one of the many people who's been bombarded with messages of how to make your $10,000 a month business in 30 days with my course that you can learn. So yeah, I think it is actually underrated. I think the value of LinkedIn is impressive. I think when I look at other social networks that there are available, Instagram, Facebook, X, and others. I think one of the things I find on those platforms in general is that they are an engine for dopamine and
Mm.
an unhealthy one at that. One person I heard referred to it as digital poison recently, and I think that is it's harsh, but it's borderline fair. I think LinkedIn has taken a different approach, and that became really obvious about 10 months ago when everybody who had been the creators on LinkedIn up until then suddenly went, "Where's my distribution gone? I'm writing posts, and suddenly the people who are viewing it is slashed by 10." And I think that's because LinkedIn took away the viral aspect and has gone down a different path and differentiated itself. And I think long term, that is going to create a value and a genuineness in the connections on LinkedIn that is not the goal of any of the other social media platforms. And I think that's going to set it apart. Already, though, I think it's a great way of reaching the right audience, almost regardless of what it is you're doing. I just recently spoke to Warren Beasley, who you mentioned that you've always been working with as well. And Warren made a really good point there at the moment is that if you want to be seen as an engineer, a senior engineer who knows their space, the place to do it is LinkedIn.
Yeah. It's refreshing to see or to hear somebody not only, you know, speaking good things about LinkedIn, but also thinking about the future and that the path on which LinkedIn is right now is a good one, and you see a lot of good things to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of things that can be said about social media in general, which is challenging and which has a sort of love-hate relationship with it. So I'm not saying that LinkedIn is perfect. It has its flaws, it has its challenges. those of us who use it a lot love to gripe about various aspects of it. But the reason it's my social media of choice is because it isn't sort of grossly addictive in the way that a lot of the others are. And it has a purpose, which is to do business rather than just to go, hey, look at me, which I see less value in general. And maybe that's just me and a personal view, but I think it's shared by quite a lot of people.
Yeah. Nice. Okay. Now, again, jumping to a different idea is having a mentor.
Hugely underrated, really underrated. I think if you're somebody who can, and so I sort of differentiate between mentoring, coaching, and teaching. And mentoring for me is somebody who has been where you're going before, can hold you to account to your own promises or commitments, and who can ask you tough questions. Um, and I think having a mentor is incredibly valuable. I think one of the key things about a mentor as well is that a mentor who is, let's say, for example, 30 years older than you and has done it a long time before isn't necessarily going to be the best mentor. But a mentor who is, let's say, 3, 4, 5 years ahead of where you are is really good. Enough to drive you, but not so much that they're pushing you to unreasonable places, unreasonable levels of growth. And I think that's key. So picking the right mentor is definitely hard and important, but having a mentor can make a massive difference to yourself. It helps you to hold you to account, which a lot of people struggle to do for many, many reasons. And it also has somebody who can ask you those tough questions. Have you thought about this? Have you considered the other? Have you considered the other person's perspective? Which is a very common question from mentors and a very powerful one. We do tend to look at ourselves, and having a mentor can help you sort of open up your perspective and look outwards. Hugely underrated.
Usually, having different perspectives helps a lot, but more so when it's coming from somebody who's been through something similar or, and speaks your language. That helps a lot.
Yeah, and I think, when you mention somebody who's been through something similar, the other thing to think about is when you have a mentor, it's not necessarily going to be the perfect mentor for you forever, right? So you might have a mentor for somebody who's really good for the stage that you're at, the place you're in for now, for maybe 6 months, maybe a few years, maybe even 5 years. But it might also be good to have a different mentor from them when you have a significant life-changing event. Suddenly you become a parent, and that can be a significant shift. And maybe a different mentor might be somebody who's going to work better with you after one of those big life pivots. So yeah, mentoring is something that's it's not a one size fits all, and it's not static either.
Yeah. How do you find a good mentor?
Good question. I think one of the key things is to think about who you respect. Because if you can respect a mentor, then you will more likely listen to them and hold yourself account to them as well. And I think the other thing is ask. A lot of people are very flattered to be asked to be a mentor. Many people will initially, when they're asked, will be a little bit hesitant or worried that they would be a good mentor. But at the end of the day, the difference between being a mentor and being a friend is not that far. It's just a difference in commitment. And I think many people are flattered to be asked. And so therefore, if you ask somebody, hey, would you mentor me? It can be as little as, an hour a month. It can be as much as a couple of hours a week.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Nice. I like the comparison with the friendship. I find it accurate. I've also been thinking about mentorship and making it very similar to a friendship. And actually, my mentor became my friend, essentially, which is awesome.
That's a good pattern to follow.
Yeah. Now, what about the Dora metrics?
Ooh, I love and hate the Dora metrics in equal measure. But generally, I think they're underrated. And the reason I say that is because I think a lot more development groups, and I say groups quite deliberately because sometimes it can be a team, sometimes it can be multiple teams, and sometimes it can be an entire organization's worth of developers, would do better to objectively measure more um, and take those into account to change. So I think generally they're underrated. However, there's a wonderful expression I love to use, which is that as a good metric ceases to be a good metric when it becomes a goal. And so if you turn the Dora metrics into Dora goals, then you're not necessarily going to get the most benefit out of it. If you have a good strategy for your business, if you have good North Star for what it is that you're trying to achieve, and keep the Dora metrics separate from that, then they're great and they can be really well used. There are a few other competing versions as well. So there's the space metrics, there's Dora metrics, and I think there's a couple of other more niche and specialized ones that you can look at as well. But in general, I would say measurement is good, but I would say avoid falling down the trap of data-driven decision making. Dora is good for informing what you're doing, but don't be driven by it.
Mhm. Okay. Now, when you mentioned the groups that would benefit from gathering more data, and they'll be doing better. In what way they will be doing better?
So I think a lot of teams will end up with something that resembles a retrospective at some point when they say, hey, what are we doing well? What are we doing badly? What could we improve on? And those things are very subjective. I feel this, I experience this annoys me. Um, and so therefore, improvement can end up being this sort of chasing the localized improvement area or chasing the loudest voice. Whereas Dora metrics allow you to do something that's closer to sort of benchmarking. And whether that's to the industry or to your sector, to your company, it helps something that's external to your team. It also provides something that is static over time. The Dora metrics are fairly absolute in the
Yeah.
measures that can come out of it. And so because of that, you can see improvements on an absolute scale over time rather than just, oh, the loud voices have quietened down.
Nice, nice. Okay, one more topic, the last one, which is book clubs.
Book clubs, good question. So I love recommending books. I've got a sort of a collection of about 20 that I regularly recommend to people. Have I ever read a book in a book club? No, I haven't. So I'd probably say that they're underrated because I think getting people to read books more often can only be a good thing. Spreading knowledge and discussion of it must be a good thing. So I'm saying underrated on instinct, not on experience.
Nice. When you said referred to those 20 books, are they software engineering books or
Some,
unrelated?
and some of them are more about leadership and management. Some of them are
Okay.
more about personal development. And some of them are very general. So yeah, there's because I think that we can learn about the craft of being engineers, being CTOs in a number of different ways. They don't all come from being a better engineer. Sometimes, as in from the technical perspective, building code, design patterns, whatever. I think some of being a better engineer often comes from a dedicated understanding of a domain that somebody's in. And that can many times be more valuable than knowing, the latest cool design patterns to use for your code structure.
Excellent, excellent ending. And on that note, now we can move on to the second part of the
A quick fire
podcast, which
round,
is
rapid
the
fire round.
quick fire. Yes. Now, are you ready?
I think so. Let's go for it.
Okay, let's go. The first one is Jamstack.
Um, I have no idea actually.
Nice. Reminder, you also have the option to skip. So
Okay,
you know,
let's skip that one.
can
Yep.
skip. Okay. Docker,
Underrated.
TypeScript,
Underrated. Although a lot of my front end friends will hate me for saying that.
Kafka,
Overrated.
cloud certifications,
Overrated.
career breaks,
Underrated.
DDD,
Underrated.
hexagonal architecture,
Underrated. Although understanding the history of it helps.
open source software.
Oh, wow. Good one. Probably underrated. I think it's one of the biggest single shifts in the industry so far.
VR, virtual reality.
Overrated. Sadly, I'd love it to
Kubernetes.
be cool, but sorry, what was that last one?
Kubernetes.
Kubernetes, overrated.
Mechanical keyboards.
Overrated. I was actually looking for a really quiet one the other day online.
Remote work.
Underrated.
Infrastructure as code.
Underrated.
Story points.
Overrated.
Developer experience.
Underrated.
Standing desks.
I'm standing right now. That's definitely underrated.
VC funding.
Ooh. Overrated.
Tech accelerators.
Overrated.
And we're done.
Cool. That last one is a fun one. Tech accelerators is one of those things where they've been responsible for a lot of proliferation and expansion of the idea of startups in people's minds. But there really are only about 2 or 3 that are genuinely effective at spitting out valuable companies. And so the stats of them, it's difficult to see how they're a great thing from an investor's perspective, but from society's perspective, they've done more for expanding the knowledge and understanding of what a startup is than pretty much anything else.
Nice. Well, I was going to ask you to pick one of the topics if you want to expand on any of them, but you already picked the tech accelerators. Nice.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was with Stephen Reddick, member of Seed Camp, and we were sort of funded by them in the early stages of Satago, which was 12 years ago now. And so they're really a cross between an accelerator and a small venture house. But they've really got something going there in terms of they've spat out a lot of companies that have survived a long time and generated a lot of value, and also at the same time taught people a ton. It was where I really got introduced to the idea of coaching and help from Carlos there, hands-on with me, sometimes giving me a pep talk, sometimes telling me that I was being an idiot. Understanding, the value of having somebody over your shoulder as you go through and build something that's effectively new, trying to do something. I actually really love it from that perspective. But then when you stand back and look at the entire industry of accelerators, and especially the ones that exist in wider Europe, and a whole bunch of them that exist in the Valley and in Texas as well, like financially, they've not been that great for the people who've invested a lot of money into them, sadly.
Yeah, it's true. But in a way, I think that's the life of a startup, right? I mean, like you said, a startup is a company searching for product market fit, essentially.
Yeah.
So not all ideas are good ideas.
And not all good ideas are at the right time for them as well. Right. There's history's littered with startups that were way too early or way too late.
Yes. And many who just purely failed and we never know about it. We never heard about them. But if you look at the stats, then it's a gamble to choose a startup.
Yeah, it is. And I think one of the things that happens very often is sort of founder disagreements. Because I looked into this a while ago, and I think one of the biggest disagreements ends up being between the tech founder, often the CTO or the person who carries that title, and the outwardly facing person, often the CEO, sometimes it's the COO. But that relationship breakdown is far too common, sadly, in startups that don't make it through to sort of Series A, Series B funding. And I think that's one of those areas where outside help can help massively. Accelerators are one of those ways, sort of keeping it online. And another way is just straightforward seeking coaching and or mentorship to go through that process and reduce that risk of, just the founding agreement falling apart.
In your research, what were the main motives for this split?
I think there's 2 that stand up. There's a lot of them. There's 2 that stand at the top of the list. One of them was disagreements over equity split or ownership split between the 2 founders, not necessarily between the founders and the investors or between investment houses. Cap table squabbles happened all the time, but particularly between the 2 founders. The other one was around the vision. And I did a really great episode on my podcast recently with Stephen Reddick, who was my co-founder, where we talked about, whose vision are you going after? Because if you're not completely aligned on where that is, you end up with this divergence. And he used this great expression. He said, if you're going on a journey of 1,000 miles and you're 0.1 degree off, you'll end up 20 miles or more apart. And, nobody can hold hands at that distance, right? It just doesn't work.
Nice. Very nice. Okay. Okay. I actually didn't expect those answers. I don't know what I expected, but not those, which is cool.
Expect the unexpected or something.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Adam. So this was it. Thank you for joining. Thank you for your answers, your input, and for sharing